Hey there, fellow comic fans. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and today I'm back with part two of my 1,200 subscriber Ask Me Anything. Leading up to getting to 1,200 subscribers, you lot asked me a whole bunch of questions, and today I'm answering those questions right off the top of the dome. That's what I did last time. We all saw how well that worked out. So let's just jump right into it. We're going to start off with a question from Groove Dude. Groove Dude, thanks so much for your support and for watching. I really appreciate it. Groove Dude says, congratulations on reaching 1,200. What is your favorite anti-hero? Great question. So there's a lot of anti-heroes that I like. But I have to say that in general, I'm not a big fan of how anti-heroes have shaped comics, um, becoming more and more popular to the point where now nobody is just the hero. Everybody's morally gray and everybody's compromised, and we have villains, like straight up villains, as protagonists. I don't like that. So a lot of the anti-heroes that I do like are sort of what I would call first wave anti-heroes, where when the comics code was changed at the end of 1971 to modernize it and actually allow for anti-heroes, then all of a sudden there was this big wave of all these new anti-heroes that came out at the beginning of the Bronze Age. Right, that's where we get characters like Wolverine and Punisher and stuff like that. um, I like sort of the more off the beaten path characters. I mean, not that off the beaten path, but Ghost Rider, Jonah Hex, the Unknown Soldier, Deathlock. Those are some of the characters that I really like. I would say Jonah Hex is probably my favorite of those. But I'm a big fan of sort of all of those that are sort of like not really superheroes. Ghost Rider is kind of the closest, but different genres. But Jonah Hex, I think, is the best of them and the best written, and my favorite of those. So thanks so much for the question. I really appreciate it. Lead Paint says, congratulations on 1,200. What's currently in your reading pile? Well, first of all, again, thanks so much for the support. I really appreciate it. I mean, I've got so many comics that I haven't read. As a completist, I got into the habit about 15, 20 years ago of completing a run before I read it, which is can be a problem. There's runs that I've put together that are hundreds and hundreds of issues, and then I start reading it, and I get like 30 or 40 issues into it, and I realize I've made a terrible mistake. And then I get rid of them without even finishing it. So I have so many comics that I haven't read that I own, including some complete runs. I have a complete run of Master of Kung Fu that I've never read. I've read a handful of issues around between issue 16 and say 35. I've read maybe half of those 30 years ago or 40 years ago. But I have a complete run of that. Never read it. And there's several others like that, like long runs. I have omnibuses that I've gotten that I haven't gotten around to even opening. I used to have a full run of Luke Cage, Power Man. Um, I had like 1 to 35 or so, and then I had a smattering of the other Power Man issues. And I didn't read them, but when I sold them, I bought the omnibus, which has all of the Hero for Hire issues, the first 48 or 47 or whatever it is. Haven't read it. So I have so much to read that it's kind of just, if something strikes my fancy and I feel like I'm in the mood, I might crack something open. But I just end up getting more back issues than I read. So even if I read 2 back issues, I might end up buying 8 in the same period of time. And so I'm just like, I'm so far behind. I can't even really define a reading pile. Almost my whole collection at this point feels like a reading pile. But thank you so much for the question. I hope that sort of answers it. Captain Beyond, Again, thank you so much for watching and your question and support. My question is, do you know why Norwegian comic books refer to Veronica from the Archie series as Doris? You would think that Veronica would translate into their language. Thanks for the great question. I've got a real short answer for this. No, I have no idea. It's a great question. I mean, I can think of theoretical reasons. Maybe there was another character in Norway already called Veronica that was more famous. That would be my number one guess. But actually, I have no idea. I did try to actually research this a little bit, but absolutely no idea. So sorry I can't help with that, but it's a great question. Okay, Mango Cats has a question for me. Mango, thanks so much for watching and subscribing. I really appreciate it. And the question is, what books do you look for first in a comic shop? The new books of the week or the back issue? Well, I think I mentioned this in the last video. I don't really read any new books from many mainstream books. I get a lot of indie books off of Kickstarter, so I'm reading a lot of titles that are like really indie. So indie that a lot of them don't have distribution outside of Kickstarter. So when I go to a comic store, they're not going to have any of those. So it's back issues. I always go to the back issues. I can usually tell within 30 seconds of going in the store whether they're going to have anything I want or not. Because my interests in back issues are pretty specific. They're old. First of all, they're old. And then secondly, they're not that easy to find. So if I go in a store, I can see pretty quickly that they have mostly stuff from modern stuff past, post 2000 or even post 90. I'm not going to find anything that I need. I'll still look through them. I always try and support the stores, but I'm looking for romance comics. I'm looking for maybe Charlton stuff. Looking for Archie comics pre 1960. There's still a few that I need from the early 60s, but most of the stuff I'm looking for is before 1960 at this point from Archie. So most places just don't have any of that stuff. And so then it's a matter of what do they have in the dollar bins. And there's a few random things I'll look for, I'm slowly putting together a set of all the Marvel 25th anniversary covers. Not sure I'll ever finish that. Yeah, so always the back issues. I'll always ask at the front counter, do you have any romance books? Or whatever. And so, yeah, it's almost always back issues. The rare occasions, only rarely will I look at the new stuff, and that's only if there's something specific I'm looking for. Like I managed to find Santos Sisters #3 at a store out in California, and that was one where they had it in the new issue area. I was really excited for that because I haven't been able to find it. So yeah, that's the answer. Always back issues. Always back issues. New stuff. I mean, whatever. I have a pull list at my LCS. They, the couple titles that I do buy, Usagi Yojimbo and Santos Sisters, they have on my pull list. So there's really not usually much reason for me to look at the new stuff. But thanks so much for the question. I really appreciate it. Let's see, Carson Reed. Congrats at 1200. Which do you prefer, Marvel or DC? Well, just piggybacking off of the last one, I don't read either of them anymore in terms of new stuff. And I haven't really been particularly interested in anything either of them are doing since probably 20 years ago. The only I haven't bought any DC books in the last 20 years, and the only Marvel ones I've bought have been Ms. Marvel, Hawkeye, the Fraction run on Hawkeye, and Squirrel Girl. That was the last series that I bought from Marvel. DC again, I bought a few things. I've read some stuff in back issues. Like the Lois Lane 12-issue series from a few years ago. I read that. I read the Danger Street 12-issue series from Tom King, which was horrible. Read that. But in terms of new stuff, I don't really have a preference because I don't read any of it. In terms of old stuff, it really depends on what we're talking about. I was always a Marvel guy. Um, I started reading '84, and when it comes to superheroes, like I was always a Marvel guy. In part because Crisis was happening right when I started reading, and I was so confused. It just was so confusing because it was right during the transition from one to the other, and I had no idea what was happening. Could not follow it. Um, so, uh, and I just preferred the Marvel superhero stuff to the post Crisis DC. So I was almost all Marvel. However, um, and that's generally true even with back issues. I mean, the Marvel superhero stuff is from the 60s and 70s is just objectively better than the DC stuff. Having said that, DC's genre output just blows Marvel away, and I've always been a big genre guy. So DC war books, I don't really read DC horror, but I do collect some because of the awesome artwork and the covers. But DC's westerns, romance, fantasy, I mean, Marvel's got Conan, but DC, so they might have a slight edge in fantasy, although I'm a bigger Warlord fan than Conan. But across the board, just DC had just so many great and so much more and much better genre books than Marvel that I kind of prefer DC. Um, these days, I don't really read superhero stuff much anymore. So kind of have turned into a bit of a DC guy. Um, Even though I think the Marvel books, like the mainstream superhero stuff from Marvel, is definitely better in terms of the older stuff, 60s, 70s. But I mean, you give me some DC war books or particularly DC romance. Um, Now we're talking. So thanks so much for the question. I hope that answers it. Okay, last few questions. Here we go. Keith Finch. Keith, thanks so much for the question and for watching my videos. Keith asks Conan, uh, Buscema, Windsor Smith, or other, what say ye? Um, Great question. I mean, Barry Windsor Smith's, or Barry Smith, whatever, as he was called at the time, absolutely amazing. Um, in some ways, I think that Buscema's art is more suited to Conan because it's more muscular, whereas Windsor Smith's work is a lot more delicate. I would say the answer for me is Buscema, but specifically in Savage Sword of Conan, where he's got inkers like Ernie Chan. Some of the work that he did in those black and white issues with some amazing inking going on is just phenomenal and much better than anything that was in the regular Conan the Barbarian series. I mean, Buscema eventually you could really tell, after he was on the book for 10 years, towards the end of his run, he was really phoning it in. I did the last Conan video I did showing my complete run of Conan. The covers are just like, here's a boring background cover. Here's a barely rendered Conan with maybe he's fighting a guy. Maybe there's a damsel. Maybe not. Whatever. Just the very sort of late 70s DC cover design. Just like a boring background cover, some boring characters being boring. But his early stuff was much better, and the Savage Sword of stuff is fantastic. So that would be my choice. Savage Sword of Conan Buscema, top of the list. Thanks so much for the question. Next question, we have Rise Falco. Do you have a place you sell any of your extra romance comics? Great question. So I did a big purge a couple years ago, which I hated to do, but people that have been watching my channel for a long time know that I had developed a lot of breathing issues, and the mustiness from my room of comics sets me off, which is too bad. I actually don't spend much time in my comic room because the mustiness bothers me, and the big offenders there are the romance books and the Archie books because they weren't really cared for at the time. A lot of them are really musty, and so I had to get rid of them. Not all of them, but I basically decided to focus my collection, and I had a lot of really low grade romance books And those are the ones that are the most musty. So a lot of them I sold in bulk on eBay. There were just so many of them, and they were all low grade. It was just way too much work to do them individually. So I actually sold them in lots of 50, and I sold probably 250 or 300 romance back issues that way, mostly DC, but with a few other things, Charlton's and stuff mixed in. And I just, again, I sold them in big lots. Now, if I have individual stuff that's sort of more expensive, either because it's nicer condition or is rarer books or semi keys or whatever, I tend to do those on the CGC forums. So I actually have a bunch of romance books set aside that I've been meaning to sell on there, and I just haven't gotten around to it. Nothing like too big, although I'll probably be selling like the blanking on the issue number, the girls' romances issue with the Beatles cover by Gene Colan. I have a low grade copy of that, but I also have one of the Beatles covers from Charlton. That's a little bit one of the ones that's a little harder to find. I've got so I've got this set of those. I'll probably sell them as a set, and then I've got just some random things here and there, and again a few that I picked up a couple years ago now that are so musty that I actually can't, like, I have them sealed in multiple bags because they're just too musty to even look at. A lot of those I'm going to be selling. There's one from that's so cool that I have to keep it even though it's super musty, but I've got to get rid of the others. And so, yeah, I've got a pile of, 20 or 25 romance books. At some point, I'm going to be selling on the CGC forums. But otherwise, yeah, if they're lower grade, I'll just do them on eBay. It's just too much time. Thanks for the question. Final question. Here we go. Great question here coming up, and it's from Sheppy Mokoena. Thanks for the question. I probably butchered that name, but the question is, if you could have a different artist draw an already existing comic run, or a different writer write a run, which comic would you choose, and which artist writer would you pick? Well, it's a really great question. I would probably always switch the artist. I can't think of any run where I was like, the art's really good, but like a different writer, other than stuff that I don't care about. So like, Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man run is one where McFarlane was writing it. I mean, it would have been better with a writer writing it. So like something like that, except I don't care about Spider-Man and I don't care about Todd McFarlane, so I don't really care about doing that. So for the most part, like, there would always be a situation where I thought the story was really good and the art didn't sort of live up to it. My immediate thought, and I don't want to poop on this artist because he's actually pretty good and he's very good at storytelling, but his line work on a monthly schedule, particularly when he was doing multiple books a month, was just not that great. Is a couple different runs from Al Milgrom on Avengers. First of all, he did the first half of Roger Stern's run. So Roger Stern took over with Avengers 227. Milgrom came on the book pretty shortly after that. I don't think he did that issue, but I think he might have been doing it as early as maybe the next issue. And he stayed on that book for a couple years and only left the book when they launched West Coast Avengers, and he went to West Coast Avengers to be the regular penciler on that book. And those are the two runs that I would switch out. Because when Buscema left Avengers, when Milgrom left Avengers, he was replaced by John Buscema with Tom Palmer on inks. They were drawing it when I started reading the book, and that art's great. So Roger Stern's run is one of my favorite of Avengers. I've mentioned before, Under Siege is my favorite Avengers storyline, and that whole Roger Stern run is great. But there's some great stories that happen before Under Siege that people don't really talk about, particularly the Vision storyline where Vision takes over the world. That story is great. And there's some stuff with Rom that's really cool, and like a lot of really cool stories there, and no one talks about any of them because the Milgrom art is just so blah. So I would love to have had the Buscema and Tom Palmer team do that entire run, or have someone else do the first half of the run. Obviously, someone like George Perez would be fantastic. But I think if they had been like a great artist on that first half of that run, things like that Vision storyline, people would remember and talk about a lot more, because there's some really good stuff at the first half of that Stern run that nobody remembers because of the art. Similarly, I would have loved to seen what the first 25 issues of West Coast Avengers were like with a different artist. Now, Steve Englehart's writing isn't for everybody. Um, is something where I think he did a lot of stuff there. It's actually a quite mature book. Obviously, they couldn't show anything, but there's a lot of really mature themes that are in the subtext going on there. And there's some really interesting storylines, particularly the crazy time travel. I forget what it was called, the cross time caper or whatever it was called, uh, which was super ambitious. Where they go back in time, and then every issue they split into it where there's a part of the story in a different time period. So by the time you get to issue 7, there's threads of the story taking place in simultaneously in 7 different time periods, and then they all come back together, and it's weaving in like all of this Marvel history stuff from previous time travel stories, like Englehart's Doctor Strange run, and uh, um, the Rama Tut storyline from Fantastic Four 19, and a bunch of other things, all tying it all together. And I'm curious what that would have looked like with a different artist, because I have the sense that that run would really be looked at very differently if it had some top art on it, because there's some really good stuff in those issues. So I'm not sure who would be the artist. I mean, those were coming out in the mid 80s. So again, I mean, Perez is the person that comes to mind, because, he was an Avengers artist and did so great on Avengers. It would have been interesting, if you have Perez on West Coast Avengers when they're launching a new Avengers #1. Basically, if you have George Perez art on that, right? Um, so those are my answers. Is like both of those Avengers Al Milgrom runs, which come back to back, drawn by somebody else, someone good. I mean, someone who could never have done that because he was just not fast enough to do a monthly book, which, ultimately George Perez probably wasn't either. But Art Adams, the West Coast Avengers is coming out in '85, and that's right when Art Adams was coming out with his first work with Longshot. Um, Again, I don't think he could ever have kept up with a monthly book for 25 issues. But like, just imagine if that was possible, what those West Coast Avengers issues would look like. I don't know. So there you have it. Thanks so much for the questions, everybody. That's it. Those are all the questions. I'm curious to know what you think down below, what your answers to the questions would be. So leave them in the comments down below. I'll see you next time.